Okay, here is my reading response video for the Edensor readings for today. Okay, so in chapter 1, he kind of starts to give an overview of what previous scholars have said about nationalism and national identity, as well as like the origin of a nation. So on page 1, he says that the nation has proved to be an imaginative field onto which different sets of concerns may be projected and upon which connections may be forged between different aspects of social, political, and cultural experience. So he says that the nation has been subject to very little critical analysis concerning the way it's represented through popular culture and experienced through everyday life. He also says there's often been confusion between like nation equaling society, which he says it does not. He says notions of society remain embedded within notions of nation-state citizenship and national society. Oh my goodness. And for that he cites Uri. And then he also cites Billig and says that society is created in the image of the nation-state. So while nation does not equal society, society does stem from nation and comes from the image of the nation. He then says that nation persists as a preeminent constituent of identity and society at theoretical and popular levels. So he says that this resulted from a lack of inquiry into how such cultures are reproduced and experienced, how they are sustained to keep the illusion that the nation is natural and not a social cultural construct. He says the nation represents the socio-historical context within which culture is embedded and the means by which culture is produced, transmitted, and received. So he considers history considers culture to be singular and fixed instead of multiple and dynamic, as do the scholars that he mentions shortly thereafter. He digresses and says that culture is not a rooted body that grows, lives, and dies. It is He cites Clifford, who says that culture is not a rooted body that grows, it lives, and dies. It is a site of displacement, interference, and interaction. So his aim in this chapter and overall in the book is to examine the way that the nation forms through like practices of popular culture, and how the many studies of particular national cultural forms tend to rely on more traditional and official forms of like culture. So like I said, the purpose of the first section is to explore popular writings on nationalism and national identity. He argues that these accounts are seriously distorted in their consideration of high, official, and traditional culture to the exclusion of popular and everyday cultural expression, and that their conception of culture is undynamic. This remains to be the theme throughout the rest of the book, where he discusses the way that we've traditionally only really looked into official culture and high culture and have excluded means of like everyday culture. So he starts with Ernest Gellner, who says that there is, who emphasizes the essentially modern origins of nations. He places a lot of faith in modernity as to the rise of the nation. He maintains that institutionalization of cultural norms shared over a large area and dissemination of national ideologies can only occur in modern and mass societies. He says that bureaucratization of many public systems are part of a wider reorganization of social and cultural life, which he cites Lloyd and Thomas here. Gellner also focuses on the establishment of what he terms high cultures. So he says high cultures are usually school-mediated, academy-supervised idioms and codified for the requirements of reasonably precise bureaucratic and technological communication. So these are also known as like garden cultures. They're presumably surveyed, tended, and codified by the specialists, who are in this case like government or political officials or anybody who would be in charge of institutionalization of such culture. He says from this like garden culture we get the canons, we get museums, and the like all the other official knowledge that's created in response to these kind of like institutionalized cultures. So again, he says nationalism is a function of modernity and the process of modernization. He says nations are the forms which are best suited to carry these modernizing imperatives, and that national organizations must keep pace with change while simultaneously reinforcing authoritative cultural delineations in order to retain authority. So we have to keep culture on track in order to maintain the status quo and maintain power lines. But the author says that Gellner's account overemphasizes the rigidity of national cultures and by proxy processes of modernity. So he poses the question, do all subjects willingly give up their cultural values in the face of nation? He says that, like, in this case, certain cultures might be eradicated or, maybe, like, adopted and adapted by the establishment, just depending. But it also begs the question of, like, who gets left out of the culture and how do we accommodate for ethnicity and religion and language and region changes and differences? So who becomes marginalized or rejected? Which we know, like, in our culture, like, we will take Mexican culture, but, like, God forbid we accept Mexican people in our country. So Gellner juxtaposes high culture with low cultures of majority. He calls them wild cultures that are local, spontaneous, and unreflexive, and that the cultural elite propagates high culture and creates a historical salience. In the next section, he talks about Eric Hobsbawm. He says that nation is essentially a modern construct, just like Gellner says. He says it's the powerful invent traditions to create the illusion of primordiality, and continuity to mask the vintageness of a nation. He says identification of the historical process of constructed culturally ancient lineage is valuable, but Hobsbawm's perspective is powerless in resisting the overwhelming appeal that they impart, instead passively ingesting ideological messages. So we're just, like, taking and being hit with all these ideological messages and not, like, really delving into it. So, like, the cultural elite create the designs and are too concerned with, like, developing tactics to control the masses, and they're not concerned with, like, the authenticity and spectacle of the culture. Whereas the popular seems to get collapsed into the ceremonial traditions, foregrounded as key to formation of national identity in the vernacular, while everyday is conspicuously absent from Hobsbawm's analysis. He then cites Guiberneau, I don't know. He says that symbols not only stand for or represent something else, they also allow those who employ them to supply part of their meaning. They do not impose upon people the constraints of uniform meaning. So there's this idea that, like, symbols are interpretive and they have different meanings to various people. And because we all come from, like, different backgrounds and different traditions and cultures, the, like, idea of invention of tradition overemphasizes the novelty of national cultures by failing to identify earlier cultural continuities. There's an assumption that the dynamic modernity repackages aspects of a reified tradition. So it misconceives contra-modernity, which states that rather than being ossified and archaic, traditions are continually reinvented in a range of different contexts. So, like, tradition has been de-ritualized, but, like, reinstalled in different ways into a contemporary society to provide a form of, like, temporal continuity that, like, gets rid of the need for reenactment. So, like, we still have these traditions, and the traditions can, like, change based on, like, the meaning that we perceive from them and the meanings that we interpret from them. But that's essentially what Edensor says. He says that tradition can be dynamic, contested, and claimed by different groups in different moments of time. So they're also according to, like, spatial and time awareness. So then Benedict Anderson is the next person that he speaks of. He says, Benedict Anderson talks about nation as an imagined community, which I believe we talked about in Brunner. But an imagined community is united by deep horizontal comradeship whereby national co-fellows are believed to constitute a bounded natural entity, and that nations emerge out of the context of social and cultural experience, which are imaginatively conceived. So essentially the key to Benedict Anderson's argument is that the invention of the printing press and the rise of the print media created means for widespread dissemination of different ideas, which led to the rise of the nation. And then he says, like, furthering this argument, this idea, is that the regular and synchronic reading of, like, a newspaper, whether it's daily or weekly or whatever, because it's periodical, it produces the idea of, like, a shared interest, and the, makes readers feel as though they are co-nationals. He says that the imagined world is visibly rooted in everyday life, and that the cultural process operates at a more mundane level. So what constitutes as national interest is part of what grounds national identity and common sense. So Edensor says that Anderson has like an excessive focus on literacy and print media that offers like a more reductive view of culture. And then he moves into Anthony Smith. Anthony Smith is critical of Hobsbawm and Gellner's insistence on modernity, and their arguments are chiefly based on the idea that nations are founded on and emerge out of pre-existing ethnies, which are what he calls ethnic groups, that shape the nation. So he bases his argument on Barth's notion of ethnicity as a mode of distinguishing the self from the other. So ascription is integral to boundary formation. He says ethnic symbols distinguish like us from them, and it doesn't homogenize the elites, but acknowledges that selection of national symbols is a source of conflict, oftentimes between different powerful groups, like who gets to decide on like what the preferred meaning of a symbol is. But he maintains still that there's no blueprint for constructing an official culture. He says that it might be imperative to select multiple national symbols so that diverse groups can confirm allegiance to the national project more easily and be more encouraged to do so. But it does recognize that cultural elements must be credible, must speak to the common sense if they are going to be accepted. He says national hegemony must be achieved rather than enforced by the elite, and overall presents culture as dynamic. So Edensor says that the focus of myths on common ancestry, shared historical memories, religious beliefs, and etc. still postulates a reductive view of culture, just like Benedict Anderson. Next, he talks about John Hutchinson, who puts forward the contrary idea of cultural nationalism. He says cultural nationalism is generally seeking moral regeneration, which links the emergence of movement as a tactical response to thwarted political nationalists as a strategy to continue the battle by other means. So moving as like a way to continue the fight. He says leaders are usually historical scholars and artists, not politicians and legislators in this argument, and that they are moral innovators who rely on national media to spread their message. They stress primordial myths and histories to raise national sentiment and bring diverse groups together. He says that history is usually overstressed in like modernity, but he does say there's a distinction between modernists and ethnosymbolists. He says modernists believe in the creation of homogeneous national culture is that the work of an elite is instrumentally controlled, where ethnosymbolists believe that the nation is historically constructed and embodied in myths, symbols, and cultures that insist on pre-modern and an ethnic basis of nation. So again, Edensor says that this argument still essentializes culture by grounding it in historical elements, and that overall all of the above mentioned, all of the aforementioned scholars tend to reduce culture to history, and like tradition and ceremonial things, and not like the everyday, like Edensor's point is. So in the next section of chapter 1, he talks about pop culture and national identity. He says that traditional cultural forms of nations are supplemented and replaced in power by meanings, images, and activities drawn from popular culture. He says power is sustained by redistribution through pop culture, mingling with other iconic cultural elements in multiple and contested ways. He then goes on to describe and define pop culture. So he says that it's a fluid term and that cultural studies emerged to counter class-ridden assumptions of what it means to have high culture. And here he cites Matthew Arnold. Cultural studies talks about high culture as its goal to make the best that has ever been known and thought in the world current everywhere, motivated by the study of perfection. He says and then Matthew Arnold was co-opted by Leavis, who insisted that the necessity of studying mass popular culture to ascertain the harm it was doing to the British nation. He believed it was doing harm to the British nation, which is like really funny because like I don't know how recent Leavis's like co-opting was, but like we still feel that way, that like TV corrupts the mind and that like too much pop culture is bad for you. But but he speaks of ads, films, fiction, and other pop culture forms needed to be interrogated to examine the damaging hypnotic receptivity that they perpetuate. He also distinguishes it from idealized folk culture and implies the necessity of national guardship over culture, which I believe is where the FCC comes in. But essentially, pop culture, according to Story, is it means widely favored or well liked by many people, but it's often vilified as mass culture, commercial and homogenous, carrying suggestion of harmful, hypnotic, and addictive qualities, as Leavis says. It's also seen as subduing the spirit and intelligence of the people via the ideological messages that it transits concerning ideas of materialism, glamour, and individualism, so like Hollywood, essentially. It's also devised to pacify the masses and accommodate them to the needs of capital, is what he says. He says it's ignored the changing and dynamic nature of pop culture and only recognizes cultural industries. He says cultural is prevalent amongst the people, and it constructs cultural producers as motivated by commercial greed and a common ideological mission. So a lot of the idea of like pop culture being a threat to national culture, because of its like identification as mass culture, stems from synonymizing mass culture with like American culture and American culture with like colonization. He says that there's a continuous perpetuation of the idea that high culture is what the nation should be associated with, and it makes this more prestigious, which makes pop culture now a site of contestation of value. However, Frau says that high culture is no longer dominant, but a pocket within commodity culture. I think suggesting that pop culture is like now, because it's popular culture, it's obviously the dominant one, whereas like high culture is just like a smaller piece. Edensor suggests that we assess cultural value by the utility of cultural forms, but he doesn't wish to reinforce a dichotomy between what is high and what is low culture. But he says there's multiple changing and contesting meanings that surround popular cultural forms, commonly presented as weighted towards heritage and common past rather than the common future or common present. Then he talks about everyday life and national identity. So the author argues that researchers of national identity tend to draw attention to the spectacular, the traditional, and the official. But like besides these, Edensor falls in line with Billig's notion of banal nationalism, which states that besides the over displays and self-conscious cultural assertions, national identity is also grounded in the everyday, the mundane details of social interaction, routines, and practical knowledge, which he says on page 17. He says perhaps it might be too apparent or too uninteresting to theorists as worthy of study. He also says that the everyday is far more dynamic than the former scholars' complacent views suggest, which while also containing enduring consistencies through which identity is grounded. So he considers national structures of feeling, argues that national is constituted, reproduced, reaffirmed, and contested in everyday life. I did think it was interesting that he cites Felsky, I think, as saying that everyday life is usually more associated with women than it is with men, because men go off and live the heroic and adventure life. They go on like the Lewis and Clark expeditions, where women often have the more mundane responsibilities. So that these suppositions mesh with the reproductive roles of men and women, because women typically are like supposed to be rearing the future nation and transmitting culture of like cooking and morals and family tradition to their children. After that, he says that everyday life is inherently conservative and inimical to revolutionary change. And then he goes into discussing a little bit about Marxist theory, and says that everyday life suffers from the institutionalization of human degradation under industrial capitalism. He says it's meant to pacify subjects who organize their lives around regressive common sense. However, Edensor says that life is not merely robotic and rigid praxis, but a multitude of other potentialities. He also says, a la Gardiner, everyday life is polydimensional, fluid, ambivalent, and labile. He says he cites Harrison after that and says that in the everyday enactment of the world, there is always imminent potential for new possibilities of life, which constantly threaten to undermine the structure laid down by habit. So then, chapter 1 is really long. Then he goes into the next section, which is conceptualizing identity. He says there's a focus on identity for Edensor, the focus on identity stresses the ways in which it is shaped through shared points of commonality, using pop culture and grounding it in everyday life. He says that identity is a process, not an essence. It's constantly being remade in consistent ways through internal and external dialectic, involving the synthesis of like both our self-definition of like who we are, and also the ascription of what others say we are. He says that we're always drawing boundaries between the self and others, and that the essentialist attempts to draw cultural boundaries between different nationalities has never been more tenuous. He says that there are theories concerned with accounting for changing conditions, heralding the postmodern epoch, focusing on the decentering of identity in contradiction to coherent modern identities. So here he lists a couple of things of what identities are and are not. He says identities are increasingly fragmented and fractured, never singular, but multiply constructed across different, often intersecting and antagonistic discourses, practices, and positions. So, here he cites Hall from 1996, which is, I forgot what it's called. I don't learn in another class because like our culture is so intermingled and like we belong to so many different groups. We've kind of become fractured, and like different things can be true for us depending on like who we're with. He also says identity becomes nationally deterritorialized, locally, globally, and then virtually reterritorialized. I don't really understand that part. But then he says identity is not necessarily or even mainly shaped by reflexive, self-conscious identification, but rather by second nature, which is our barely conscious set of assumptions about the way that we think and act. On page 28, he says that. And then, like, he says that many theorists often neglect the continuities which tether identities in time and space. He says national identity does not equate with homogeneity, nor is it inherently defensive, conservative, or tradition-bound, but that globalization promotes the mutation of national identity, so our national identity is, like, constantly changing. Please don't do that. He says Rorty argues that rather than being centered, we should think of identity as centerless, in a contingent web constituted by networks of beliefs and desires, and many other points of association. Okay. Then he says there's like that we need to disembed the idea that the nation is the fundamental basis of society, and then he starts to talk about like space and spatiality, and there's the notion of like fragmented spaces, third spaces, or marginal spaces that reinforce the ideas of postmodern geographies, which challenge the primacy of like a national space. And he cites Doreen Massey, and her progressive sense of place. He says that places are characterized by the multiple connections constituted by the different processes and flows which enter upon them in different ways. But that national identity relies on condensation symbols and flexible sense making. That was only chapter 1. Wow. Chapter 2, he talks more about like conceiving the nation in spatial terms. He says there's like a relationship between space and national identity in a multi-scaled and variegated. It's constituted by borders, symbolic areas, constellations, pathways, and everyday fixtures. And he once again emphasizes that the national is evident in the spectacular and also the mundane. He says that the nation is a preeminent spatial construct in a world divided up into national portions with borders. These borders enclose and they enclose a particular and separate culture, which is articulated by the hegemonic ways of cultural differences. I'm gonna sort through my notes. It says that the nation is always under the threat of being decentered as the obvious space of sovereignty and identity by like large supranational federations organized around trade, and like maybe interest groups. I don't understand. And the next part I thought was really interesting. So he talks about you can't talk about the nation without like conjuring up some sort of idea, which is like true, because I know he's talking about England a lot of the time in this piece, but I was like thinking about America the whole time, and like the idea of like what it means to be an American based in like symbols and like landscape. But he says that the landscape stands as a symbol of continuity, as like a product of land worked over, produced, and etched with the past. It's used to produce a purified space, and comes about in response to the perceived threat of change. And so, like, for America, he says that the landscape conjuration is the West, which was typically thought of as masculine and conquered land and rugged and manifest destiny, and it's like a way to create yourself when frontiersmanship kind of became popular because industrialization happened, and it kind of like made men feel less secure. Surprise. Then he talks about iconic sites that are like meant to embody specific characteristics, and they serve as sacred centers of identity. So you have like sites like the Stonehenge and Taj Mahal, which are meant to like remember the Golden Age. You have monuments that are meant to commemorate significant moments in history, such as like the Statue of Liberty and the Arc de Triomphe. And then we have some that celebrate the modernity of the nation, like the Empire State Building and the Sydney Opera House. And so, like, when we attack these landscapes, like we did, like, if we had the attack of the Twin Towers, that seemed like to many people not just an attack on America, but an attack on America as an idea. He says that there's sites of pop culture and assembly and congregation, like Times Square and Trafalgar and Bombay, which is like an unfixed space where the tourists and locals can mingle with one another. And then he talks about different things like dwellingscapes and taskscapes, where like we have an everyday like practical orientation because like we root ourselves in routine and tradition, in the way that we like repeatedly do the same things in these task spaces. Like at my job, I do the same things and I create routine, and my identity as like a store associate is managed through that. And he talks about the homely space after this, because the notion of home is synonymous with nation. In chapter 3, he spends more time focusing on how national identities are reproduced through the metaphor of performance. He talks about how identities are enacted and reproduced, informing and reconstructing a sense of collectivity. The notion of performance also foregrounds identity as dynamic, always in the process of production, continually reconstituting identity, and it's impossible to fix an exact meaning of identity through inaction. But by examining scripts and roles, stage management, directing, etc., we can investigate the parameters of performing national identity. He says performances vary by setting and spatial zone and are regulated to varying extent because we're often scrutinizing our fellow performers. He cites Butler's notion of performativity, which is like through repetitive iteration, performativity materializes gendered bodies as unambiguously fixed and bounded. Talks about the embodiment of the experiential body, and that consciousness is embedded in the body, not separated from it. Then he talks about rituals and invented ceremonies. So we talk about like these like huge ceremonies, which appear to be time-honored but are actually invented traditions from the Romantic nationalism era, which is what Hobsbawm and Ranger say. He says that at these like types of things, they're typically achieved through passions and solemn and precise formations of movement with high production values, wherein a higher power demands a stylized and repetitive performance from participants, which is how memory and identity become inscribed in the body. It creates what Connerton calls a social habit memory. After the popular ritual section, he starts to talk about other like types of popular rituals like sport performance, because it's a global spectacle and it's situated in mediatized matrix of national life. It's institutionalized in schools and widely represented in a host of cultural forms like the Olympics. So he says that sport was traditionally used in the English public school system to reinforce national superiority and develop characteristics of moral manliness deemed necessary to rule the colonies. So like sport performance even expresses a particular form of embodied capital valued by particular groups, because it's a way to like keep boys as boys. He says there's a lot of vigorous identity management that takes place during sporting events. After that, he talks about staging the nation. He talks about how tourism encourages the production of distinct kinds of stage and is an activity which sustains a host of competing performative norms. National tourism increasingly seeks to compete in this global market by advertising their distinct charms. They try to carve out like a unique niche that like hordes of people might come to make them the money. But he says in order to entice the tourists, they must stage the nation accordingly. He talks about everyday performances. So he says the national identity flavors everyday life in familiar ways, and a common sense rhetoric of national talk makes an unnoticed backdrop to public life. And he cites Spillman here. So performances, the continuity and reliability of familiar interactions contribute to a sense of security grounded in our experiences of predictable routines in time and space. Since such performances are shaped by unreflexive assumptions and dispositions as often as they display intentionality. Habits are a way to economize life, he says. So like that's how we come to know, who we are and how we make space in the world for ourselves is through our habits and routines. Shared norms of performers consolidate norms of everyday performance. So there's like popular competencies. He lists like 3 norms, which is like popular competencies, embodied habits, and synchronized inactions. So he says popular competencies are everyday practical knowledge which enable people to accomplish mundane tasks. So like knowing, knowing when you meet someone you have to shake a hand. You know that. Otherwise you appear incompetent. Then we have the embodied habits, which form what did I write there? They form bodily texts and social interaction and are often crisscrossed with class, gender, ethnicity, and age. Closest to Bourdieu's notion of habitus as practical and embodied knowledge. I didn't really understand that one. And then we have the synchronized inactions, which are the enduring repetition of daily, weekly, and annual routines and entrenched notions about when particular actions should be carried out. So these are going to be like knowing you need to brush your teeth twice a day, once in the morning, once at night. Knowing you have 3 meals to eat, you have breakfast, lunch, and dinner, and there are times when you're supposed to eat them and times when they're not acceptable to be eaten. Then he talks about how performative norms need to be continually enacted in order to retain their power. Then he talks about materiality, which made me think about like Dana Cloud. He says that things provide material proof of the shared ways of living and common habits of people. So until recently, objects have been relegated to a position of insignificance, but people typically grow up in like relating to things and changing but identifiable object worlds. So human societies are invariably supported by material infrastructure, and that social interaction is partly enabled and characterized by the things which pass between people in the mundane material transactions of everyday life. He talks about, on page 104, he talks about actor network theory, identifying the relational nature of objects, and how things are often the topic or talk of the focus, or the focus of action, and they often facilitate interaction or mediate by providing a form of interaction other than language. Object structure, sense, and sensuality, because they're situated in relationships with environments and bodies. And objects are a tool that engender familiar, practical, and sensual capacities. After this, he talks about commodities and national identity. He talks kind of how like materials can serve as our national identity, which for me, this section made me think about like Coca-Cola and how we see Coca-Cola as like it's like distinctly American, but it's also like not, because it symbolizes a lot of things like diversity, or at least that's what they push in their commercials. But like Japan has Coke, and like everybody has Coke. After that, he talks about biographies of objects. He talks about the individual and collective narratives that are often organized around objects, and there's shared things that anchor people to a place, and this like works in tandem with like the nostalgia boom that's happened lately. So these objects are a sign of their own historical and geographical context, and we keep them for reasons that like really kind of can't be explained, but we have like old pictures and certificates and trophies and awards and etc. And like keepsakes and like like if someone my age had kept like a Polly Pocket or something, it's like a weird blast from the past. Then interestingly enough, he talks about car culture, and how like various aspects of identity can be construed through like your car culture, such as like your economic status, your ability, and etc. And then he talks about the symbolic role of the national car industry, and how it, more than any other, becomes exemplary and indicative because its presence or absence in a national economy tells us the level and power of that economy. Because I know that, like, when we had the, not depression, the recession, in like 2008, I know there was like a lot of conversation about like GMC having to go bankrupt and everything. And it was like it was the sign that like our economy had been hit really hard. And then he also talks about like movies that are about cars or songs that take place in a car, or like just like symbols of the car and what it means. And then finally in chapter 5, he talks a lot about national identity being sustained through the circulation of representations of spectacular and mundane cultural elements. He says these elements become naturalized and disseminated through books and television and film. And then he spends like kind of the rest of the chapter talking about Braveheart, and the strong sense of like Scottish national identity that it was supposed to bring to the table, but how the weight of stereotypes and stark symbols like militarization, the Highland, the Tartanalia, and etc. Actually led to certain people and scholars and theorists finding Scottish popular culture to be embarrassing and banal, and oftentimes criticized as inauthentic, which, like, for me that really resonates because all these movies about like the Wild West and people just associate it with Texas, and so like my entire life I meet people who are not from Texas and I tell them I'm from Texas and they're like, oh, so you ride a horse to school, oh, so you own cows, and like, no, I don't. But Texas culture has been like reduced to that, it seems. So yeah, I haven't actually seen Braveheart besides that like one speech, but yeah, this book was like a lot of theory and a lot of it kind of went over my head, but like I understood that his main point was like there's reason to study everyday life and how it often serves to like create our identities. Cool.